Senator Mansfield gives his eulogy, and at 2:19 p.m. the Kennedy family will leave Capitol Hill, and the American people will then have the opportunity to come to the rotunda to pay their respects to the president. So at 2:19 p.m. on November 25th, 1963, or no, excuse me, November 24th, 1963, 2:19 p.m., the Kennedy family leaves the Capitol, and the American people are going to begin to pay their respects. Now remember, that's going to go till when? 9 o'clock that night. Okay. Now, here's where it gets kind of interesting. It shows you the respect for the president. By 1 o'clock in the morning, the next day, on the 25th, people were still in line. So they had made the decision way prior to that they would not shut it down at 9 o'clock. They would leave it open as long as people wanted to come. And by 1 o'clock in the morning the next day, they had estimated that over 76,000 people had filed by the president's casket by 1 o'clock in the morning. The significance of the 1 o'clock time was that they knew a lot, they could see a lot of people were still there, so instead of having them come in single file, which they had done in lines, they went 2 by 2 and eventually went 4 by 4 because they didn't think they could get the people out of there in time for all the things that were supposed to happen the 25th. Okay? So, Kennedy officials had planned to close the rotunda at 9 p.m., but they decided to keep it open as long as people wanted to come. Well, they didn't anticipate the number of people. And by 1 o'clock in the morning, on Monday, November 25th, there were approximately 76,000 people that filed by Kennedy's coffin, and then they made the decision instead of single file, they'd go in lines of 2, and as it continued, they eventually went to lines of 4. Now this is the one that really blows me away. By 2 o'clock in the morning, on November 25th, the line to see the president, now listen to this, was 3 miles long. Think about that. How far is it from here to the post office? Probably. So think about that. 3 miles long by 2 o'clock in the morning. Huh?
How long was it?
Well, it just got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And then, it got bigger, so at 1 o'clock they said, well, gee whiz, we better go 2 by 2. Probably by 1:30, well, gee, we better go 4 by 4. Well, by 2 o'clock in the morning, the line was 2 miles long, or excuse me, 3 miles long. Guess when they finally shut the doors of the Capitol? 10 o'clock in the morning the next day. 10 o'clock in the morning the next day. So what was supposed to close at 9 p.m. on November 24th, finally they had to close the doors at 10 a.m. the next day, and obviously people were turned away, but they had no options at that point. Now, although they didn't have an exact count, historians estimate that somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 people filed by the president's coffin from approximately 2:30 in the afternoon on the 24th till 10 a.m. on the 25th. About, could have been as much as 500,000. That's just, to me, incredible. I'm not sure you'd see that today. Well, that'll take us then to the actual burial of the president. Quite a few names here, and we'll kind of explain those to you. The burial of the president. Now, the question you might have, and we'll back up a little bit, is the biggest issue probably that Mrs. Kennedy had to do, other than organize this funeral to make it appropriate, which I think I told you she modeled it after Abraham Lincoln's funeral. But the biggest decision she had to make was, where are we going to lay the president to rest? I mean, you think about it, he was shot on Friday, and she's got to make a decision by Monday, and actually earlier than Monday, because they got to prep the site or make preparations. Well, most of the members of the Kennedy family wanted the president to be buried where? No, in Massachusetts. They wanted to be buried in his home state of Massachusetts. But they were considerate and kind and left the final decision up to Jackie. She was the wife, But just so you know, most of the Kennedy families wished that he be buried in Massachusetts. But they gave the final decision to Jackie. Now, where he was buried was kind of by chance. And just kind of listen to me. 1 week before his assassination, President Kennedy took a trip to Arlington National Cemetery. And you'll get a chance to do this as well. And he went up to the front steps of the Arlington House, which has an incredible view of Washington, D.C. You can see everything. You can see the Washington Monument. You can see the Post Office Pavilion, the Lincoln Memorial, the whole thing. It's a really cool view. Now, back up, the Arlington House belonged to General Robert E. Lee during the Civil War. And he abandoned his plantation during the war, and the Union actually took it over. And to disrespect Lee, they buried Union soldiers that had fallen in his garden around his house. They're still buried there today. So what happened is, to disrespect the Lee plantation, they buried Union soldiers, not knowing that that hallowed ground would become the most inspirational burial spot of anyone that serves our military. It's just kind of an interesting story. So anyway, the Arlington House, when we get off the subway to go to Arlington, we'll look up and you'll see the Arlington House on top of the hill. Well, anyway, Kennedy was standing up there looking across at the city. And he marveled at its magnificent view. And Jackie said that he had talked about that several days afterwards, about that view. So, on Saturday, November 24th, 1963, after returning from Dallas, Secret Service agent Clint Hill takes Mrs. Kennedy to Arlington, and she gets in that impressionable spot and makes the decision that they will bury her husband at the bottom of the hill. And that's where he's buried, at the bottom of the hill, right below the Arlington House. So that's how the place was chosen. So Mrs. Kennedy went back to that impressionable spot in front of the Arlington House and selected the area below it as the final resting place for the 35th President of the United States. So, November 25th, 1963, it's a Monday, and President John Fitzgerald Kennedy is going to begin his journey from the Capitol Rotunda to burial at Arlington Cemetery. At 11:40 that morning on Monday, November 25th, Robert Kennedy, Edward Kennedy, and Jackie Kennedy arrived at the Capitol. They entered the rotunda. All three knelt and prayed at the casket. They got up and left the rotunda. At 10:40 a.m. on Monday, November 25th, 1963, Robert Kennedy, Edward Kennedy, and Jackie Kennedy arrived at the Capitol. They enter the Capitol rotunda. All three kneel and pray at the president's casket, slowly rise and leave the rotunda. 5 minutes later, at 10:45, the casket bearers remove Kennedy's casket from the Capitol rotunda, take it down the very steep stairs of the Capitol, and then place the casket on the horse-drawn caisson. Here are the men that did that. And again, I want you just to get your ID sheet out. All I really want you to do is write down the branch of service that they were serving, okay? So there were 9 casket bearers involved in this funeral procession. The commander of these 9 were Samuel R. Byrd, who represented the United States Army. Again, these are on your ID sheet. It might be easier just to write after their name what branch they were in. It's up to you. So the man that led the 8 men that were officially the casket bearers was Samuel R. Byrd from the United States Army. The 8 casket bearers for John F. Kennedy's burial were George A. Barnum, United States Coast Guard. If I was you, I would just write them on the ID sheet. Save yourself some time. George A. Barnum from the United States Coast Guard. Hubert Clark, United States Navy. Timothy F. Cheek, United States Marines. Richard E. Godrow, Air Force. James L. Felder, Army. Douglas A. Mayfield, Army. Larry B. Smith, United States Navy. And Jerry J. Diamond, United States Marines. So there were 9 men involved. The 8 that were chosen to actually carry the casket: George A. Barnum from the Coast Guard, Hubert Clark from the Navy, Timothy F. Cheek from the Marines, Richard E. Godrow from the Air Force, James L. Felder from the Army, Douglas A. Mayfield from the Army, Larry B. Smith of the Navy, and Jerry J. Diamond from the Marines. I've worked hard here, and I have Barnum, Mayfield, Godrow, Cheek, Felder, and Clark signature. That's pretty good collection there of the 9 that were involved. Obviously, most if not all these people are deceased. But those were the casket bearers. Now, these casket bearers are going to have the responsibility to carry this very heavy casket down the steep steps of the Capitol to the waiting caisson at ground level. And I'm just going to talk about a couple of them, and you can just listen, you don't have to write it down. And this is what they were quoted as saying about their experience in doing that. It seems like we take that for granted, right? This is what Timothy F. Cheek said. He was a 20-year-old Marine. This is what he said. He said, "I was in a trance. We were kids totally focused on doing our duty as well as we could. My thought during my duty was, don't drop the casket, especially down the steep rotunda stairs. One falter, and that casket was gone." Very, very heavy. You'll see it on video. It was difficult to get down the stairs. Army Sergeant James L. Felder, African American, by the way, he said, "This was the part we were all frightened of. We wet our gloves and prepared, took a grip. We got it down the steps no problem, breathed a sigh of relief, and put it onto the caisson." Their whole worry was getting that thing down the steps without it being non-processional. I think the casket was incredibly heavy. Okay? Well, at 10:50 a.m. on the 25th, the casket had been secured to the caisson, and the funeral procession begins from the Capitol to Arlington. If I made you walk that, I think you'd have some whining going on. It's a long ways. Okay? So it's a long funeral procession. Now, one of the more symbolic things is right behind the caisson, where the president's casket was resting, was blackjack. Anybody know what blackjack might have been? It was a riderless horse in which on the horse's saddle were empty reversed boots to signify a fallen leader. So in the stirrups backwards were military boots. Same one, not same boots, but the same fashion in which Lincoln was buried. They had the blackjack, military horse, saddle, riderless, boots in the stirrups backwards to signify a fallen leader. One of the toughest responsibilities during this funeral procession was keeping control of that horse. Horses aren't used to being in that type of parade. This horse was as skittish as any horse under the circumstances. And the man that was going to be responsible to keep that horse under control was Army Private First Class, 19 years old, Arthur Carlson. He was a member of the prestigious Old Guard. We'll tell you what that is in a minute. So the man responsible to keep blackjack under control was 19-year-old Army Private First Class Arthur Carlson of the prestigious Old Guard. Now, if you don't know what the Old Guard is a select unit. You are selected for that duty if you're a member of the United States Army. You guard the tomb of the unknown soldier, and you perform most military funerals in that area. Now, if it's a Navy funeral, the Navy does it. If it's an Air Force funeral, the Air Force does it. But the Old Guard prepares the caissons all that stuff. That's their duty. I do have a signature of Arthur Carlson up there with a picture of he and Blackjack. That was, you'll see that distinctly on the video. Now this is where it got kind of interesting, because Mrs. Kennedy insisted on walking behind her husband's casket during the funeral route rather than riding in an automobile. Not only is that a long route, but when she decides to walk, who else is going to walk? Robert Kennedy, Ted Kennedy, and of course Clint Hill, because he's still protecting the First Lady. And that's going to provide a little bit of what? Concern. What just happened? We just had security. Yeah, I mean, she's not going to be protected in an automobile. She's going to be walking the route, and so is the Attorney General, and so is Senator Ted Kennedy. Now, it even gets crazier than that, because as I mentioned, I think to you yesterday, every civilized country in the world was represented at the funeral. They sent somebody except for China and Albania. What do you think those leaders wanted to do in respect to Mrs. Kennedy? Walk as well. So all of a sudden, you ever seen the movie London Has Fallen? Anybody see that movie? I mean, that was a state funeral where all these people came, and this is in today's world where they had this problem. Well, all of a sudden the Secret Service has got their hands full, because they're not only protecting the First Lady, the Attorney General and Senator Ted Kennedy, they're also now protecting all of these world leaders that have come to this state funeral who are walking as well. So it became quite a scene, quite a scene. Well, they didn't go straight to Arlington. Where did they stop at 12:14 p.m. on November 25th, 1963, you Catholic kiddos? They stopped at St. Matthew's Cathedral, where Kennedy's funeral mass was going to take place. Now that'll be the first place we're going to get off the airplane. We're going to go get our stuff unpacked and get a little bit organized. First place I'm going to take you, Saturday, April 6th, is to St. Matthew's Cathedral. First place you'll get a chance to see. And there's a significance there other than the President having his funeral mass. Well, the man that will perform Kennedy's funeral mass and also perform the ritual at the gravesite will be Archbishop Richard Cardinal Cushing. Archbishop Richard Cardinal Cushing from Boston will conduct President Kennedy's funeral mass. Archbishop Richard Cardinal Cushing of Boston. He will do not only the funeral mass at St. Matthew's Cathedral, but he also will be the one providing the service at the burial site. Now, any of you Catholic boys in here ever served as altar boys at the church? Yeah. Okay. Well, they had 5 altar boys at this funeral mass for President Kennedy. One of them was 12-year-old Reamer Donnelly. Reamer Donnelly. So one of the 5 altar boys at the Kennedy funeral mass was 12-year-old Reamer Donnelly. Now the reason he was chosen is because Reamer's father and President Kennedy were good friends. Reamer's father was a doctor, and before Kennedy became president and served as senator, Reamer's dad treated both Senator Kennedy and Jackie Kennedy whenever they had any health problems. So Reamer Donnelly was chosen as one of the 5 because of his father's long association with President Kennedy, and as I mentioned, Donnelly's father, and actually they were classmates at Harvard University, but he served as the doctor for Senator Kennedy and Mrs. Kennedy prior to the presidency. Here's what the 12-year-old Donnelly stated 50 years later when he was 62 years old. This is what he stated about his memory of that. He said, "When you're 12 years old, you just think about how it affects you as a 12-year-old. And I guess I connected to the children and the wife. I just thought about the kids losing their father and the wife losing her husband and how sad that was." That's what he thought about when he was 12 years old. Well, at 1:21 p.m., following the funeral mass, the body of President Kennedy was placed back on the caisson in front of the church as the Kennedy family waited for it to be secured. So at 1:21 p.m., following the funeral mass, the body of the slain president was placed back on the caisson in front of the church. and family members were waiting on the steps as the casket was secured on the caisson. And as the family is waiting and they're playing Hail to the Chief, Jackie Kennedy leans over and whispers to her young son, John Jr., and as soon as she's done talking to him, the 3-year-old stands stiffly and salutes his father's coffin. Everybody have one of these? Let's read this. His world was strangely different. In little ways the child notices but does not understand. Where is his daddy? The tall man with laughing blue eyes who had a big desk and saw lots of important people and stooped to spank him good-naturedly and took him on helicopter rides and called him John John. This was supposed to be the day of the party. The cake with 3 candles to blow out, the friends singing happy birthday, the gifts. But this day was different. The soldiers outside, whose salutes he delighted in trying to return with one of his own, looked different. They didn't glance down at him and sneak a wink or smile today. Their commands barked, their rifles clattered. They stood on the bottom of the steps. Pallbearers appeared at the door with the flag-draped casket, and as it came slowly toward them, Mrs. Kennedy leaned down and whispered to her son. He stood apart, straightened stiffly, and raised his hands to salute as the casket passed. A little boy at his grieving mother's side saluted the passing casket, and in that moment he suddenly became the brave soldier his father would have wanted him to be on this day of all days, for today John F. Kennedy Jr. turned 3. 3rd birthday. Okay? Now, I'm going to continue this a little bit, and then we're going to read another thing. David Powers. Oh, you need one more? David Powers. Do you remember David Powers? He was